Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today's show, we're talking about how to dig up dirt on any property developer in New Zealand. That includes how to get access to 10K worth of data for free, how to read this data so you can figure out, well, which developers are growing and which ones are shrinking, and also the 3 steps that you absolutely must take before you start trusting any property developer in the country. And the reason we're talking about this is probably at the start of the year, I stole about 10 grand worth of money from Andrew, and I came up with this idea of we should come up with a database of developers so that you can research them, because it's quite difficult to.
And we get asked all the time, what do you think about this person? And what do you think about this person? And there's a way to just find it all in one spot.
And one of the interesting things that I actually have never told you, Andrew, is when I was a kid,
Here we go.
I found out about this website called Cult Watch. I don't know how I found out about it.
Is it actually cults?
Yeah, it's about like religious
Oh my
cults.
God. Look how old this website looks.
Oh, it's real old. It was good back in the day though. But like let's find one that's like not very controversial.
Brian Tunke.
Is that controversial?
Yeah, no,
no, that's not controversial these days. And they talk about is it a cult or not? And I always thought, I'd love to create Cult Watch for property developers. To be honest, in my mind, this was a much better website. But back when I was looking at it, it would have been 2006, maybe 2007. So what are we talking, like almost 20 years ago? This was groundbreaking. It's probably not been updated in the previous 17 years. But here we go. We've got Cult Watch for developers. And let's just chuck in like New Zealand's largest property builder, GJ Gardner Homes, and see what sort of data you can find out about them. I mean, what are you seeing here, Andrew?
So I think the first thing is how many consents they've got being issued, and so whether or not they're increasing or decreasing. Now, the whole market has been decreasing over the last couple of years, but you probably want to get a sense of whether or not it's completely dropped off the side of a cliff or whether or not it's just dropped down to a more moderate level at the moment while the market's hard.
Yeah, so GJ Gardner's dropped from about 1,685 consents a year. So that was the peak in 2021. And they've dropped right back to just under 800 consents in the 2024 data.
And the next thing you maybe want to have a look at is what is the average build price? So if you look at GJ Gardner's again, for example, you can see that they've been steadily increasing year on year. Now, does that mean that all of a sudden they're a really expensive builder and I don't want to build with them? No, not necessarily. That might just mean that they're building bigger houses or more bougie houses.
Yeah, I suppose the big thing as well is we've got this awesome rating on the side as well, where you can say, okay, well, how big is this developer? Well, because one of the big questions you might ask is, okay, 799 consents, is that a lot or is that a little? Actually, that's a lot. So they are the biggest builder in New Zealand, biggest home builder in New Zealand at the moment. Their build cost is above average. It is on the more expensive side, but they are also building, relatively large properties, and they've been around for a while. And so I guess, there's a lot more in here, Andrew, but if you're digging through, how do you start to use this information? What information's important? What information's not? Because sometimes people will say, look, it's great info, but how do I use it?
So I'd be thinking here about, okay, well, if I'm going to go with GJ Gardner's, the age of the company probably gives me a bit of comfort that they've been around for a while, so they're probably more likely to be around for a bit longer. That would be my first kind of thing. Then I'd say, okay, well, they're a larger development company. Some people prefer to work with a larger company. Some people prefer to work with a smaller company. So that's kind of a personal preference. Then I'd probably look at the build cost and size together. So then I'd say, okay, well, I'm looking for a house. So I would expect it to cost more to build that, but I am looking for a developer that's going to be able to produce a larger style property for me because I'm looking for a family home. These are the right fit for me, for example.
Yeah, I think property size and build costs become quite important, especially the interplay between them. So if we consider somebody like GJ Gardner and we compare that to, let's use another well-known property developer like Wolfbrook, which was one of the companies people wanted to know most about at our recent webinar. We can see that their build cost of their property size is actually a lot lower. So GJ Gardner, their average property size is 165 meters squared, building it for 540 grand. Wolfbrook, they're building townhouses. And so their build cost is roughly half of that, if not slightly under half. The average build cost is 240 grand against a property size of just under 100 square meters. And so that tells you something about the sort of properties they are used to be building. Now, Wolfbrook don't build standalone houses, but let's say they had that offering. You'd probably look at this data and say, okay, well, they're probably not the sort of person you'd hire to build you a standalone home because they're building lots and lots of smaller, more affordable properties. Now, again, they don't specifically have that service, but that's an example.
And again, if I'm looking at the number of consents, because I want to know, yep, have they got some substance in terms of being able to weather the storm that we're currently in at the moment in terms of the harder market? Okay, yeah, they peaked at 329 back in 2022. They've dropped like everyone has, but they're still maintaining quite a good level in terms of properties that they're consenting.
I'll tell you the other reason why I really wanted to create this is if we look at a bigger company like a Wolfbrook or a GJ Gardner, we've written lots of reviews about property developers in the past. I've got a whole one about Wolfbrook. But if I think about a smaller home builder like Orange Homes, we've actually had them on the show before. There is no chance that building, how many are they building? Like 30 a year. There's very little chance that we're going to write a whole review about them. And so if we can get data for the top 200 developers and just give it away for free, that's going to be a good thing for people because then you can actually use it. I suppose the other thing that's quite interesting is really comparing like-for-like developers. So, okay, comparing Wolfbrook and GJ Gardner, they are quite different. So it's kind of hard to get a meaningful comparison between them because they are building quite different properties. But if I was to compare people who are building something quite similar, so say Oakridge is a Canterbury-based developer that builds standalone homes, and I also pull up data about, say, Golden Homes, which also operates in Canterbury, but also around the whole country, then because they are building similar properties, we can get quite a meaningful comparison. So what are the sorts of things we'd look at, Andrew?
Well, the first thing I'd probably look at is, okay, does the developer size and the age of the company, does that give me some comfort around, who I'm buying with? And if that ticks, if we tick that box, then I'd move on to probably the build cost and the build size. And then I'd compare those next to each other. So I'd say, okay, the size might be, for example, on the average for Golden Homes is 131 square meters, and the average build price is 350K. And then if I look at Oakridge, I'd say, okay, well, the average size house is quite a bit bigger, and actually the average build cost is quite a lot cheaper. So if I'm looking for a larger house at a more affordable price, I'd probably say Oakridge wins out of that.
Because in this case, I think Oakridge's houses on average are 25 square meters larger, but cost 45 grand less to build. And so that's where you start to get a bit of insight. You take the data and you're like, okay, this is quite interesting. This gives me a sense about which way that I should go.
The other thing I really like here is, and I know you can get this from Google, but you can look at their most recent Google reviews and the average of them. So, okay, there's only 15 of them for Oakridge because they're a newer company, but they're all really, really good. Let's have a look at Golden Homes. I actually haven't looked at theirs. So their average, so they've got 15 reviews as well, but their average is 3.5. So same number of reviews, but significantly worse reviews by the looks of it.
Unfortunately for them, the two most recent reviews for Golden Homes, and which Golden Homes office is this? This is for Golden Homes in Auckland. Their two most recent reviews are actually 1 stars. It's really important to understand that we can only pull Google reviews at the moment for like one office. Now, for a smaller developer like an Oakridge, they only have one office anyway. For Golden Homes, which is a franchised company, I don't know the exact number of offices, but they might have 20 different ones around the country. And at the moment, we're only pulling from one of them. So make sure you check that out. And let's say you were buying from Golden Homes in Invercargill. Well, their reviews might be quite different from the ones that we're showing on this website because these are being pulled from a Golden Homes office in Auckland. So do just keep that in mind. I always say some data is better than none, but we do also just have to be careful about it. And that leads to a really good question about, well, how accurate is this data? And it's quite funny because on a podcast not that long ago, we were talking about David Reed Homes, and I'll actually pull up their data so we can talk about it, Andrew. David Reed Homes, we were talking on the podcast about how they peaked back in 2006 at like 189 consents, and they'd fallen off a cliff according to this data, going down to about 18 consents in 2024 for this period that we're looking at. And I actually got an email from David Reed's business development manager.
Is this after the webinar?
No, after one of our, it was a podcast maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. And he said, Ed, I really like your podcast, but just talk to me about where this data's coming from, because you're saying 18 consents, but I'm not sure whether this is entirely accurate. So just talk to us briefly. Where did this data come from, Andrew?
We get the data from a company called BCI, and basically they go out and collect a bunch of information, and then they collate it, and then they produce it publicly. You have to buy it though, right?
You got to pay for it.
Yeah. And so that basically shows all the consents that have come in from the different various building companies. Now, one thing that David Reed's pointed out is that it doesn't necessarily capture if they've got someone who independently applies for a consent. So I'll give you an example. Imagine I want to build an architectural home, and I go to an architect and they design it for me. The architect might apply for the consent rather than the builder. And so as a result, that doesn't get caught up in David Reed's numbers, even though David Reed are the builders for it.
Yeah, I put that to BCI as well, though, and said, hey, this is the feedback I've got. What's your take on this? And they said, well, we've got 26 researchers who call up developers all the time to find out what's going on in the market. We've got a specialist building consent team who's through their experience and their algorithms, trying to amalgamate that data. So even if the architect submitted the consent, trying to get that into David Reed's numbers. I'll tell you one little story as well, and that's a little bit funny. We've kind of had conflicting views out of David Reed as well. Like, because when we were on the phone with them, they were like, okay, just remind us, what did you say for the 2024 data? And we said 18 consents, and they said, oh, yeah, maybe that sounds about right. But I know that specifically at the end of the year, they're like, well, we signed 60 contracts over that year. And so what you've just got to be aware of is consents and contracted sales are quite different. So they might have got 18 building consents issued, but they signed many more contracts, and those might come through next year. Another good example would be probably a company like Williams Corporation at the moment. So I think they are at just over 200 consents, but then 225 consents over the period we're looking at. But their number of sales could be higher, or it could be lower than that, because we know that one of the reasons that the building has slowed down is they've got quite a lot of completed stock. This doesn't tell you how many properties they've sold. It only tells you how many properties have been consented.
Yeah, and having a consent to build something doesn't necessarily mean you're going to build it either. The other thing is the way I would take this information and say, okay, well, even if the number's not correct, the number would have been would have had that same variance over the last 10 years, because you'd had the same issue with David Reed Homes where people were using architects as well. And so I just look at the kind of direction of everything, right?
I always think the direction is the most important thing. Like, does it matter that GJ Gardner peaked at like 1,600 properties and is out 800? I don't know if that 800 number is exactly correct, or whether that 1,600 number is exactly 1,685 as opposed to 1,686 or 1,684. The exact number doesn't really matter. What matters is the trend, and also the comparison to other developers as well. So let's say that GJ Gardner's consents were massively undercounted. Well, if that undercounting happens across all developers, well, the relative position of who's larger, who's smaller, that should still be intact. But what I would always say is you can pick holes in any data set, right? Like, you absolutely could. If I wanted to play devil's advocate, I could be on my own YouTube videos being like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He hasn't counted this. He hasn't counted that.
That's what I do at the weekend.
Oh, really? That's what I do when I comment on your videos. But we've got to understand that just because something might have a couple of flaws doesn't mean that that it has no value at all. We've got to acknowledge the flaws while also acknowledging the benefits. Just one other thing, speaking about David Reed and BCI. So when I called up BCI and said, hey, I've had some questions around this data, what they said was, well, this is going to be really positive because for example, if David Reed got in touch with them and said, hey, look, your numbers aren't correct. We had more than 18 consents in this period within 2024. BCI will be like, sweet, give us your numbers and
we'll update it.
We will update it.
Isn't it amazing that BCI, because they've been around for as long as I can remember, it takes us to do a webinar for Dave Reed to actually look at the numbers and then contact them?
Well, I think what David Reed were talking about, and I think this is a pretty fair point, is in the past, BCI, they put out reports and they're kind of industry-based PDF reports. So what I mean by that is they get a PDF of all the numbers and it's a massive table. And I'll actually show you one, Andrew, because I've got one. I'm pretty sure I've got them right on my desktop. There we go. I'll show you what it looks like because it's not. Oh, we'll look at the Taranaki one. So if we look at house builders in Taranaki.
Are you going to say that their argument is that no one really looks at them?
Well, I probably am going to say that. But, we get this table of numbers, and I don't expect anybody to understand exactly what this means. But, it's just got the consents broken down. So GJ Gardner, Taranaki, this is for 2019. They did 5 in January and 5 in February and 1 in March. And, to be honest, the average consumer isn't going to look at this. But I think because now we're making it public and saying, cool, these are the numbers, I think they're like, okay, well, if it's just builders sizing themselves up against other people, I probably don't care. But if customers or people who are buying properties or wanting to build properties are then using this to make a judgment call, actually, we probably care a little bit more about correcting the record. And I think that can only be a very, very good thing. To make sure that the data is as accurate as possible. I know you've also had emails from developers about this.
I've had more emails about this than any of our webinars before, and either from customers saying, hey, I noticed that XYZ aren't on there yet, or a developer saying, how the hell do we get on here? We're not on this list yet. So
I'm quite surprised by that because I
think a lot of people would be worried about it.
I thought it was the opposite. I thought, take me off that. That was what I was expecting. And there's
especially
why aren't I on there? I want to be in there too. Yeah. I want to be on Property Developer Cult Watch.
Because some of the developers...
Duval, it's a cult.
Because some of them have seriously dropped off the side of a cliff because a lot of developers are sitting on their hands at the moment waiting for the market to correct. Some of those names emailed me. I thought, surely you don't want to be on there at the moment seeing this massive drop-off, but they want to actually be on the list.
Oh, look,
they want to be part of your club, Ed. For the first time ever, people want to be part of Eddie's club.
Oh, I love it. Eddie's developers, that's what we'll call it. And a lot of people said, well, why aren't they on the list? So what I've done is all we've looked at is this specific period in 2024. So it's between October 2023 and September 2024, because that was the data we had available. And we said, okay, let's just look at the top 200 developers within that period. So let's say that there was someone, I'll just pick a random name, who's not on there, like Grow Crop Frere, which is a quite a large developer in Christchurch, right? So they're not currently on there. And the reason might be that within this period that we looked at, they didn't issue a lot of consents, but maybe that's because they're building all of the properties that they consented the year before. So they could still be very, very busy. They just haven't done a lot of consents within that 12-month period. And so at the moment, I've only got the top 200 builders or the top 200 consenters for this period, but I've got a lot more others on my list. I'll tell you the exact number of developers who I've got data on. Here we go, ranked developers. Do I have all of them in here? Yes, I do. Let me make that really nice and large because I'm old.
Am I reading that right, saying it's 10,000?
Yeah, so we've got data on just over 10,000 builders. Now, quite a number of those are going to be like, let's just look at the one that's actually at the bottom of my list. So Wish Homes, doesn't that sound like the shopping app? So they've basically built nothing until I think 2024, where they've consented 3 properties.
So
right?
Very few people are going to be searching for Wish Homes. So you've left them off for now.
Exactly. And so anybody who's kind of these very small builders that have maybe only done one project, we've kind of left them off. And I've just said, okay, give me the top 200. But Andrew, the other thing that we mentioned that we'll talk about at the start is, okay, what are the 3 steps you've got to do before you trust a property developer?
So developer database, that's number one. So you've looked at the data there and gone, yep, these guys look like the right fit for me. Then you want to go to good old Google. So go to Google and use the news tool.
So we're looking at Google News, not just at regular old Google.
Yeah, and let's give you an example. So Flower Day Homes is a good example. So that there's a developer I get asked about often. So you might search for them and have a look at, okay, what does the news say about them? And more importantly than just the name of the company, you want to dig into who the owner of the company is and then search their name as well. So let's go to Flower Day Homes.
So if we jump on their website and we look at who's in their team, we see that it's led by a guy called Rick Flowerday. So let's have a little look-see at that in Google News.
And probably I'd also encourage you, don't just look on the About page on their website, look at the company's office and then do a search of the shareholders and directors as well, because it might be that someone is behind the scenes and they're not publishing them on the internet.
Okay, so if we Google Rick Flowerday, there's some more recent articles, but there's this one from 2008.
And this is an article about the fact that Rick was actually tied up with a company called Blue Chip. And some of you older listeners will remember Blue Chip were a big developer that collected a bunch of deposits off people and then went broke and didn't pay anyone back. They ripped a whole lot of people off, basically.
And so this might give you a bit of a sense like, oh, okay, maybe these are some questions that you want to ask if you want to work with a specific developer going forward. So I think Google News is a highly underutilized tool. I know everybody says, Google them, just Google them. But I specifically reckon Google News because then you're going to be able to get articles that might be buried.
And you also want to make sure that you're using Google correctly. So do you want to show how you use inverted commas to make sure you get a name correct?
Oh, yeah. Okay, this is pretty cool. So this is what's called Boolean logic. So if you say, hey, look, I don't want Ricky Flower Day. I don't want Rick Flower Days. I don't want Rick Flower Da. I just want this specific phrase. So if you chuck a double apostrophe around the name, that'll just search that specific phrase. Just be a bit careful because in this case, I think the name was
variation
Rick.
Was actually useful, right?
Yeah, it was quite useful because I think the name was maybe Ricky Flower Day in that specific article. Let's find out. Let's find out.
It is always interesting when you're looking up names. People that do have stuff that they don't want you to find, you'll notice they change their name or the way they advertise their name.
So on
Ricky's
here,
obviously gone from Ricky to Rick, and I'm sure he might go as Richard if something else went wrong.
Well, that's actually funny you should bring that up because another one that I've heard about or often get asked about is a company called Investment Build NZ. And I remember we used to get a lot of questions about them because they were doing a lot of social media advertising. And they've got quite a nice website. They've got a logo with a lion in it. You know, in 2021, they built 43 investment builds. So you're like, okay, I'm interested in building an investment property. Maybe I should talk about these. Now, one thing that's quite interesting, and this kind of comes to the third thing you should do, is there aren't a lot of names on this website, just a guy who either calls himself Blake or Blakey. So one of the things I often recommend people do is go to the New Zealand insolvency register, and this will tell you whether a company or a person has been bankrupted in the past. So if we just type in Blakey and hit enter, we see that twice a person called David Blake or David Blakey has been made bankrupt. And so that happened in 1991, happened in 2006. My understanding is actually he changed his name again, and I think it was 3 for 3, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so, but I couldn't recall it straight off the top of my head.
And so that might be like, okay, maybe this is not the sort of company that I particularly want to work with. So some combination between using the developer database, that's step one. Step two, checking out Google News specifically, both the name of the company and the name of the directors, perhaps even the shareholders, other people who are involved with it, and then the insolvency register as well. And that'll give you a really good understanding of what comes up.
And I think I spoke about this on the podcast last week as well. Sometimes if you can't find information on a website, like just basic information, that is a major red flag for me that I will dig in even deeper. So we had an example where there were some properties that we were going to have a look at, and I went to the developer's website and there was just nothing about them. No name anywhere. I thought that's really, really weird. And so then I end up going to the domain registration, and I did Ed's trick of using the privacy policy and the terms and conditions, couldn't find anything. Then I went to the domain registration page, the WHOIS, and then I found the phone number, and then I Googled the phone number with the inverted commas and ended up tracking it down to an ex-Deval employee. Now, that wasn't an issue in itself, but once I scratched the surface some more, it was a couple of Deval staff members that have gone out and started their own thing, one of whom was quite a senior member of the team and a director there, so that would not be someone that I'd be recommending. So you really want to just see if you can scratch the surface and go a bit deeper, particularly when companies are vague. They don't talk about who's behind it.
Yeah, a good example of that probably is Investment Build. So we've got a first name or just a name, Blake is the contact, and a phone number. Typically, my trick is to go to the privacy policy or the terms and conditions on a website, because it will usually say what the company name is. So this presents itself as investmentbuild.co.nz, but what is the company name that I can then take and put into the company's office to find out who the shareholders are? One other trick is to go to the Domain Commission in New Zealand. I know Andrew used a slightly different website, but if we type in investmentbuild.co.nz, we confirm that we're not a robot.
I don't know that ticking a box will confirm you're not a robot.
No, it does. That's how they do it.
Water on you.
Don't do that. And what we can start to see is, well, who registered these domain names? And we say, okay, there's this person, Blake DNZ. Okay, yes, that probably is David Blake. We see a company, Builder Management Limited. Okay, they're the registrant contact. Now I can start to search for them. And so that kind of gives you a sense of, okay, well, how do I dig a little bit deeper here? So that's how to get free data about any developer in New Zealand. That's how to read it so you can kind of get a sense of whether these developers are really good or not, and the 3 steps you must take before trusting a developer. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.